With Lululemon, the real gift happens when they're living in it. When you give the fan favorite everywhere belt bag, the real gift is... And when the ultra-soothing Rest Feel slides are the gift, you're really giving them... This holiday, Lululemon makes it easy to give little luxuries that go beyond. Open the moment. Shop now at Lululemon.com.
His code name's Jackal. He's an exceptional assassin.
Streaming now on Peacock.
He will kill again, unless we stop him.
Academy Award winner Eddie Redmayne.
You're paying me to kill him. I am charging you for getting away.
The Jackal's here. Look at the exits.
BAFTA Award winner Lashana Lynch.
I will find him, and I will kill him myself. I like to win.
So do I.
The Day of the Jackal. Streaming now, only on Peacock.
Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, as part of an irregular series, there will be more of these in the autumn, I'm talking to one of our regular contributors, Lea Ypi, about her favourite political fiction. In this case, it happens to be a play. It's not a play I knew before, but now that I've read it, I can't get it out of my head. Lea is going to be talking to us about the significance of, the meaning of, and the mystery of Henrik Ibsen's The Wild Duck. Lea, full disclosure, when you said you wanted to talk about Ibsen's The Wild Duck as a great political fiction, it's not just that I'd never seen it or never read it. I'd never heard of it. Right? I know about Ibsen, but I didn't know about The Wild Duck at all. And I haven't seen it, but I've read it now, and it's pretty amazing and quite weird. So it's a bit weirder than I thought it was going to be. But I also remember when you said that you wanted to talk about it, that it was something that you go back to. So I want to ask you a little bit about that. But first of all, so I came across it when you told me about it a few weeks ago. When did you come across it? Did you first see it or read it?
So it's a kind of long story, but I'll make it into a short story. I first came across it when I was about 8. And in Albania, where I was living at the time, we had an attic where all my grandfather's books from his university days went. I don't know if I told you the story. My grandfather was a political prisoner in Albania for 15 years, and he was a kind of taboo character. Nobody ever talked about him in my house, but there was this attic where I knew all his books were. And the other part of it is that in Albania, books were not the kinds of things that you just go to a shop and buy them whenever. There had to be a supply. So usually what happened every month or every 2 months or whenever, there was a supply in the children's bookshop, and I would go and buy books. And that meant that if you finished the book that you had to read for that month too early, then there were no books, that you'd had to wait for another month or so for the new supply. And so this was one day I remember I was kind of getting really bored and complaining and so on. My mom said, well, why don't you go up in the attic and see if you can find anything there? And so I go up, and this was in a very, very dark place. And I mentioned the attic because the attic is also in the play and plays a really important role. So I go up there and I look through the books, and most of them were these. He studied law in Paris. Most of them were these very boring law university books, penal law or civil law or whatever in French. And then there was this one book in French with on the cover with the wild duck. And it was the only thing that I thought as a child was a children's book. So I picked it up. I was very excited. I was like, I found the wild duck. And my parents, my grandma hadn't read it. They didn't know what it was about.
Right, like me, but they had more excuse not to know about it than I did.
And I just read it in one afternoon. And I remember I was completely traumatized by it. Genuinely scared. I mean, if you're an 8-year-old child, it's quite scary. And you have this child character that dies at the end. And actually...
I know. So there's a plot spoiler for people who are listening. The girl dies at the end, and we're going to come onto it. And there is a scary attic as well. So I can see why it would have...
Exactly. So it was one of these kind of completely traumatizing reading experiences, and obviously completely not the right age to read it, because I don't remember understanding anything about the plot. The only thing I remember from the first time I read it was that there was this attic where there were animals and where there was hunting going on. And then there was this duck and this girl who was killing herself. And I had just been in an attic and found this book. And so this became completely, the subject of paranoia.
But I'm impressed that you finished it, because to discover that the girl dies, that means you read it to the end. I mean, how did you keep going? Maybe there was nothing else to read, but if I had been 8, trust me, I would have given up well before the end, trying to read something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I was getting really bored, but I somehow, because I had assumed it was a children's book, and I read it as a children's book.
So you kept waiting for the bit where the animals came to life.
I kept waiting. Exactly. And then these animals appear, and then the child appears, and then I didn't understand anything around it, but you keep following it because you're interested in the animals and the child, and the animals being hunted and stuff, and this duck that is very precious to this child, all of which we can talk about.
Did you get that it was a play? Did you understand it was a play, or did you think it was a story?
Yeah, no, I got that it was a play. I mean, we had children's plays as well in Albania, so I was familiar with the genre. But it's just that
it is quite a weird play because we never see inside the attic. So, I can imagine as a child as well, you know what a play is, which is a performance where the things in the play are visible to you. But the key stuff in this play is not visible to the audience.
Is not visible. Yeah, no, absolutely. But I had been in the attic. I had seen the attic. And so it was it was completely a traumatizing experience. And as I say, when I read it, I continued to read it as a children's book, and I finished it as a children's book. And I was very upset by it. And then I think my father eventually read it, and he said to me, well, it's not really a children's book. And he made no effort to explain then what it was about, other than telling me that this was not age appropriate. So eventually, when I was a little bit older...
How much older? Not like 11, I'm hoping.
No, I mean a teenager, like maybe 14, 15. That was when I was doing already more adult readings. And I remembered this book that I had read that had really scarred me, but that I did not understand what it was about at all. And I decided that was a time in which I was reading more, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and more important books. Or not more important, more serious ones for a child, for an 8-year-old. And more adult, let's say, because I think children's books are also very serious. And then I got back to it and reread it as a sort of teenager, and I've returned to it. And I think every time I return to it, I see it with different eyes, because obviously in every different stage, so you can read it as a child. Well, I wouldn't recommend people give it to their children, but you can read it as a child and it's a play about farm animals and the wild duck, or you can read it as a teenager and it has this mystery and this, family that is this family tragedy. And that you just kind of take it in, as teenagers often do with books. They just take everything in and it makes them think, but not in any specific way necessarily. And then I read it later when I was already into Kant scholarship and Kant studies. And then it became to me more a play about the limitations of that kind of Kantian attitude that I've somehow committed to. And so I both identified with Gregers and was repelled by him. And that's what makes it a very disturbing play for me, because I sort of identify with the fundamental stance of the character who starts the whole thing. But then it's also a really good wake-up call for that position, in a way, from this position that says, fiat justitia pereat mundi. And since, as I say, I feel like I identify with that position, this play is always healthy to read, because it reminds you that there is always another to every position.
So we're going to have to explain to people who Gregers is, and the very last line of the play suggests that he might be the devil, and we need to talk about that as well. But I'm interested, so when you read it for the second time, you were 14, so the young girl in the play is actually 14. So she's not an 8-year-old girl, she's a 14-year-old girl. And she's actually, at the end, I think the way it ends, it's deeply mysterious. Her death is actually deeply mysterious. When you read it when you were 14, and it's about the death, we think the suicide of a 14-year-old girl, were you traumatized again?
Yeah, but at that time, I also didn't think it was a suicide. I had read it as an accident. And in the book, it's left open whether it's a suicide or an accident. I now read it as a suicide. But again, it's interesting what you project into it. And it's obviously completely devastating if you read it as a suicide, way even more than if you read it as an accidental death. At the time when I read it as an accidental death, I had begun at that point to sort of identify with her, but also think of her more as a child and of myself as a grown-up. And I think she represents in some ways the loss of innocence and the possibility of reconciliation somehow that is gone and is just not given in the world, and this harmony and unity that just disappears.
she is a very childish 14-year-old. I was actually surprised at the end because I'm not sure if it says that she's 14, but reading about it, she's described as a 14-year-old. And I had more pictured her as maybe 9 or 10. But it is also interesting. So I read it for the first time. I'm 57 years old, so I'm not a teenager. And I just took it as suicide. And actually, when I was emailing you about this, and I had my questions, and one of my questions was to me the deep mystery of why she kills herself at the end. But I am aware that it's not completely unambiguous. So we need to get back from the beginning to the end again, because we've been talking about the end of this play. So without wanting to spend 10 minutes summarizing the plot, maybe we should just try and condense it, because I think the interesting question is not what happens, but what's it about? Because you can read it. I've only just come to it, but I can see you can read it in many different ways. It's about a family, the Ekdal family. So 4 of the 5 acts take place in the apartment of this family, which contains a husband and a wife and a daughter and an older father, an elderly father, and an attic. None of the action takes place in the attic. The husband is a photographer, and we get a bit of background in Act 1, which doesn't take place there. It takes place in the grand house of another family. And in that family, the son is this man, Gregers Vela, and his father. Just as concisely as you can you characterize the relationship between these two families? Because it is, in the end, the key to the play.
Well, the play starts with Verle, Gregers Verle, returning and meeting his father, and he's at a dinner party. He's pictured as this very idealistic man who, at this dinner party, learns about his father's old friend, who is the old Ekdal and old business partner, who has been unjustly accused for something in which his own father, so Verle's father, was also involved. However, Verle's father got away with it, whereas Ekdal, so the old Ekdal, didn't and was punished, and indeed then was indebted to Verle for many, many, many years to pay for the consequences of this business activity that has collapsed and has led to tragic consequences for one family, but not for the other. And so Gregers learns all this story, and so learns a truth that is very disturbing truth about his mother, his father, the implications that in some ways the survival of his own family has had for the fall of this other family, the Ekdal family. And then the whole play is about this man who wants to bring justice to the world somehow, and who is very idealistic and wants to reveal to the Ekdal family, and in particular to the son of this old Ekdal man, Hjalmar, what the truth is, thinking that that truth will somehow bring some greater, more authentic living, I suppose.
And the truth in question is not actually the truth about that business fiasco. Very early on, we're meant to understand that there was a villain, but the villain may not have been the actual villain. The Ekdals may have been scapegoats for the nefarious activities of the family who end up wealthy and powerful and successful. But the truth that the son, Gregers, wants to reveal is not fundamentally, I think, a truth about the origins of his family's wealth. It is about marriage and sex, and ultimately whose child this girl might be.
That's right. So another part of the story is that there's a maid who has been working in Gregers' family called Gina, with whom his father had an affair. And then at some point when this other man, Ekdal, fell from grace, his father arranged for the maid to marry Ekdal. And there was a child from this marriage, but now in the play we're led to believe that this child might actually not be the child of the Hjalmar Ekdal. He might be actually the daughter of this illegitimate relationship. And so in a way, Gregers is also concerned about somehow doing justice to his dead mother, who is the one who we are told has told him this story, that, this Gina, this woman who is now married to Ekdal, with whom he has a daughter called Hedvig, was once his father's lover, and therefore he thinks that he needs to also reveal the truth about this relationship that the younger Ekdal doesn't know, and who he's married and who his daughter might be.
And there are two ways to read what's going on between the older, wealthier Vela and the younger Ekdal. So the younger Ekdal is a photographer. This is 1884, we should say. So I'm not sure what photography was like as a profession then. Maybe precarious, maybe not, but also required quite a lot of equipment. And he is set up in business by the man who we believe ruined his father. And that man has supported the household. Everyone is aware that the household is being supported by someone who used to employ the wife of Hjalmar Ekdal as a maid. And one way of reading it, and probably the way that Hjalmar Ekdal reads it to start with, is it's a kind of expiation. There's some guilt in the old man. He knows he's ruined the father. He gives the father copy work to do. He's trying to kind of make up for the fact that one family was ruined, one family was enriched. And it looks like an act of penance. But as the play goes on, and as Gregers starts telling his truth, we start to see it completely differently, that he is supporting this family not as an act of penance, but because he is ultimately actually trying to support his daughter, his illegitimate daughter, whom he's palmed off on this family. He's not interested in the woman who was his mistress. He's happily palmed her off on someone else. But as the play goes on, the suspicion arises that actually what he's been doing has nothing to do with the parents or the old man. It's because he knows that he's providing for his daughter. And they're two very different readings of that relationship.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And we're never told actually what is the truth about this, whether the daughter is the real daughter or whether the daughter is the product of this illegitimate relation. But what we see at the beginning is that this is a functioning family. So there is Gina, the mother, Hedvig, the daughter, and Hjalmar, and it's a sort of a happy environment. And Gregers goes to live with them, and with this intention of progressively revealing that somehow their entire life is based on a lie and on this illegitimate relationship, and actually on an injustice from which he thinks his own father has benefited, and that he needs to remedy and needs to make these people see what wrong has been done, and that from this revelation they will come to some more authentic form of life. This is, I think, roughly what's going on throughout the play.
So people might be hearing us talk about this and think, well, where does the attic and the animals and the wild duck come into this story? So what we've just described is at least a recognizable subject of a fraught domestic drama. But there's a wild duck in this play, and there is an attic full of animals.
So maybe we should say something from the plot on that as well, just to make it clear what's actually going on. So the story there is that another person who lives in this household is the father, who was the business partner of this rich man who then fell in disgrace, and he was once a hunter. And what the family has recreated is a kind of hunting environment in the attic where he shoots animals, and then there are lots of different farm animals, chicken and so on. And then there is this wild duck, and the wild duck is a duck that was rescued, who had at one point fallen deep in the lake, and people thought that the duck might die, but actually was lifted up. And although it was very, very badly injured, it was sort of lifted up from the depth of the lake and saved, and also brought in the attic. And Hedvig, the daughter, is very, very fond of the duck. It's her favorite animal, in part because it's very different. And all we're told in the play, all the other animals, we know where they come from, and they have families, whereas the wild duck is a mystery where it comes from and what its family is, and so on. And also this idea that it was shot and then was somehow managed to recover from that episode, and something very unique and very special that is there in the play.
And we've been told that old Ekdal, one of the glories that he hangs on to in his undignified and ruined existence is that he was once a hunter. And that's a big part of his identity. And so he's been given this indulgence, which is to hunt in the attic. Now, when you read this when you were 8, presumably you thought, yeah, people hunt in attics. You might have animals in your attic. The attic is portrayed as being like a forest, and it's sometimes described as being like a forest, and he goes hunting there. When you read it when you're 57, trust me, it doesn't come across like that. I mean, there's some deep symbolism here, but it also messes with your head a bit, because this is in many ways a realist play. The social setting is very realistic. The depiction of class and hierarchy and status is very finely tuned. You get that very clearly. And a lot of the dialogue is like a piece of social realism. And there's an attic which contains all these animals and a kind of forest, and an old man goes in there with a gun and he kills the animals. And it is quite hard to pull the two sides of this together. There is deep symbolism in this play, and there is realism. It is, I don't know if there's a term for it, symbolic realism or realistic symbolism. But what the hell is the attic? You're going to have to tell me how to understand the attic. We never see it. Have you seen a production of The Wild Duck?
Actually, never seen it, no.
So I don't know whether you hear it, whether you definitely hear one gunshot at the end, but the implication is actual hunting goes on here.
Yes, that's right. You're led to believe that there is actual hunting regularly there, and that this is one of the places where the old Egdal retreats and then every now and then kind of comes down to. So I always pictured it as you say, as a forest. And for me, what it represents is the state of nature. And that could be the state of nature, not in some ways the state of nature where things get disrupted and animals get killed and so on, but it's also a state of harmony and peace because, he finds the old Egdal is happy there. He recovers his old life. He remembers that when he was a hunter, he was doing all these things and somehow now finds them in the attic, and he's created this space where he feels at home and part of his life, his old life, is back. Hedvig is very happy there because she has the wild duck and she enjoys it, and there's animals there and she plays with it. It's nature, both in this aspect of the state of nature where there is killing and animals, but also in the other element of it, which is harmony and unity, and something that gets disrupted by the intervention of a human to bring something that is, we are meant to believe at the beginning, the realization of an ideal of justice.
We're going to come on to that because that is the key to it. But I'm still a bit fixated on the attic because if it is the state of nature, I think it's also true that for most members of the audience, what they would take from that is that the state of nature is a fantasy, that this is in many ways the old man's fantasy. You've got two symbols of a kind of freedom here. One is the wild duck, and the wild duck is wild and is real. I don't think you read it and think that the wild duck doesn't exist, that there is a real wild duck in there. They've rescued a duck. And of course, you could easily keep a duck in an apartment in Norway in 1884, and indeed have other animals in there too. What you can't do is go hunting in the forest in an apartment. So the old man's vision of freedom, which is actually an attempt to recapture for him something that's been lost, which is for him to be a hunter was part of his status, actually, apart from anything else. His state of nature is fantastical. The 14-year-old girl's state of nature or natural experience in the attic is real. It's more like, so I picture her going in and there's like a menagerie of chickens and a wild duck.
Yeah, that's right. Like a farm, like having a little farm in your,
Yeah, like a farm, and a girl would play that, and people do keep I mean, even today, people keep chickens in their apartments.
Yeah, we used to keep chicken in my house when I was little.
Right, but people didn't go hunting in your house, right?
Well, they were killed if it was New Year's Eve. My mom would go in the bathroom and just kind of slaughter the chicken, and
Yeah, but not with a gun.
Not with a gun, no, but with a knife. So this is in some ways what nature is, right? It's both a place of innocence and self-abandonment and thinking about your old self and your own dreams and reconciliation with something that is lost in urban society, but also a bloodbath, basically. And it's not nice. So it's a state of nature in both of these aspects, I think, that in the way in which nature features in a lot of writing as both, as I say, a state of war, but also a state of peace and reconciliation and natural harmony.
There's one other symbolic feature of this play I want to ask you about before we get on to what Gregers does, which is that the husband, not the old man Ekdal, but Hjalmar Ekdal, the father of Hedvig, we're constantly told throughout this he's a photographer. He's trying to run the business. The business is really struggling. People, presumably it was an expensive thing. People aren't paying for photographs, and it's an elaborate business. But he has this side project, which is called The Invention, or The Great Invention. And everybody is encouraging him in this. He seems to take it very seriously, though, as we get further through the play, it's like he hasn't actually done anything. It's just early on, you think like he's on the cusp of discovering some great thing. I don't know what this thing is. Later on, it feels more and more like it's a fantasy. I have two questions, actually. What did you think the invention was? So to start with, I thought they were meant to be suggesting, has he invented moving pictures or something? But it gets vaguer and vaguer what the invention might be. It's just the sort of thing a man might do to give meaning to his life, which is discovery. What is the invention?
Yeah, so for me, the invention doesn't actually exist. And the reason I think that is that there's this other character that we did mention, is a neighbor called Relling, who keeps talking about the life lie. And this word, the life lie, now I don't know what the original Norwegian is, but the word keeps, and I don't know how it's translated in other languages, the word keeps coming back, the life lie. And at some point, Relling declares, if you take away the average man's life lie, you take away his happiness as well. And so he's basically saying, look, there are some illusions, including illusions of success or this great invention, that are essential for people's emotional stability, for their happiness, for their harmony. And I actually think of Relling and Gregers as the two opposites there. So Relling is the representation of happiness, even as an illusion, but as a kind of necessary illusion. And on the other hand, you have Gregers, who represents, as I say, virtue. And a lot of the play and the fact that every dialogue in which they are both together is a conversation basically between these two things. So, how do you create happiness? And then at what cost do you realize virtue? And that's for me the key element of the play, the key dynamic somehow. And the life lie is this possible way of looking at the world, and which is it's all convention, and justice is just a result of convention, and there are certain norms that sustain the way people live, and we don't need to go and scratch the surface too much and really try and find out what it is exactly that sustains it. We sometimes just have to keep sustaining the illusion without asking ourselves. And because when you do try and question it too much, then you really get the real tragedy. And I think that's where Ibsen is going with the play, in a way. And that's why it's such a disturbing play for me.
This episode is brought to you by Skinny Pop Popcorn. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Oh, so light and crunchy. Skinny Pop Original Popcorn is the snack you've been searching for. Made with just 3 simple ingredients: popcorn kernels, sunflower oil, and salt. Snacking never felt or tasted so good. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Give yourself permission to snack and pick up Skinny Pop Original Popcorn today.
There are 2 life lies, actually, and Gregers only wants to undo one of them. So I think Relling's view is that the 2 things that are sustaining the Ekdal family, they're living a fairly tough existence. They've been ruined by the wealthy people. There's a lot of bitterness and resentment and all of that. And they could be consumed by it. They could be consumed by their circumstances. But the 2 things that are keeping them going are, for the man himself, this illusion that he might invent something that will restore the family's fortunes, but particularly good name. I think he's more interested in the good name than the fortune. And secondly, they are a relatively happy family. They seem contented. He really loves his daughter. And everyone's willing to sustain the old man in his illusion about what goes on in the attic or not. But there's a sort of general propping up. We're not going to question too much because we're rubbing along. And actually, at some level, we love each other. And in comes Gregers. And Gregers doesn't want to expose the invention as an illusion. Actually, he's quite keen to encourage him in the feeling that you can go further down that road. The thing he wants to blow up is the illusion that this is a happy family, because it is built on a literal lie. So the invention is a fantasy, but he thinks the lie is that this is your daughter and this wife wasn't the lover of the man who ruined your father, and that I think the language is used, no true marriage could be based on such an enormous lie. And in a sense, that's his idealism. And it's not just bracing, it's kind of horrifying.
Exactly. Also because he thinks that if he reveals the truth about the tainted origins of their relationship, once they know it, then they will be able to begin from scratch in sincerity. And it's not that he wants to, and this is again the other tragic aspect of Gregers, I think, as a character. Well, we'll talk about what he is in the end, but the way I read it, it's not that he wants to destroy the family. I think he just wants to help the family rebuild on solid foundations based on knowing everything there is to know about each other's past and about each other's internal life, and to really start from scratch. And therefore, the invention encourages that idea that there is this ideal to look forward to and that you can all move forward with this ideal in mind. You just need to clear the myth of the origins somehow. And the origins are that they are a family that in some ways his own father helped create, because he was the one who suggested Gina marry Hjalmar. But in fact, what he needs to reveal is that this is all a lie, and that a lie of which his family is part. And so it's also a way for him of redeeming himself and that's often what comes out, especially at the beginning when he has these conversations with his father. This is a son who is very troubled by the actions of his father. And so for him, revealing the truth to this other family is also a way of revealing the truth to his own family, and so creating a new life that is for him also an authentic life, and a life based not on lies, but on sincerity. So that's where the kind of the fates are twinned.
It's a bit like things that you read in the papers all the time. There were always letters to sort of agony columns in newspapers where someone says, I know that my best friend's husband is having an affair. Should I tell them? And you get different kinds of answers to that question. But sometimes the answer is yes. The truth is really important here. And there are reasons that you should reveal the truth that is otherwise obscuring the true nature of the relationship. And the person who's written the letter may well be doing it because they can't bear the guilt of knowing and all of that. That's all recognizable. The bit that's completely outlandish is his belief, which no agony column will say, which is, and as soon as you've told the truth, these people will move onto a higher plane and they will immediately embark on a true relationship. So he leaves the house having told the truth. This is where he's nothing like the advice you might get in a newspaper. And he comes back the next day and, the newspaper advice would be, and you may end up breaking the marriage, but that's the price of honesty. He comes back the next day and he says, why aren't you all getting on? And he discovers that Halmar is furious. He's possibly going to, leave home. He's not speaking to his daughter. He's introduced a bomb into this family. But he seems to believe, he literally says to them, am I now walking into a household of harmony? And you want to shout at him, what the hell did you think was going to happen?
And Gregers has this sentence at some point where he says, I believe in the invincible power of truth. And he thinks that this truth will actually give them the real happiness, which again, from a Kantian perspective, resonates because the whole Kantian idea of happiness is happiness as a result of having done your virtue, having done your duty. And so happiness that results from virtue, not from pure satisfaction. So they're a satisfied family. And what Gregers wants to do is to make them realize that their happiness is an illusion. It's not true happiness. That true happiness comes from doing your duty. And in this case, the duty is a duty to truth.
I get that Gregers might think that he's done his duty, but in what sense is it their duty to know the basis of their marriage? So Gregers, clearly a weight is lifted off him when he tells them the truth. And to be honest, even when the girl is dead, he still seems to think he's done the right thing extraordinarily. But there's a difference between the duty to truth of the truth teller and the idea that the truth that is revealed is itself another version of that for the people who have to live with the consequences.
But I mean, this is the thing, right? So this is why I read it as a play about deontological ethics in a way. Well, at some level, I read it as a play about you have a duty everyone has a duty to sincerity and to knowing everything there is to be known and setting up relations with full transparency about the past, the present, and then with clear head about the future. And the cost of it is kind of irrelevant. And that's why Gregers, in the end, as you say, it's obviously tragic what's happened, but it's a necessary consequences of justice being done. And this, again, resonates with me because in Kant, you have this sentence where he says, fiat justitia pereat mundus, like just, when justice is, I don't know what the English translation is.
Let justice be done, even if the heavens fall, is effectively, I think what that means.
Exactly. Their heaven is fallen, and this has happened. And now you have the kind of ideal Kantian picture, in a way. That's why I find this play really disturbing from my perspective when I read it.
Yes, I'm going to ask you in a bit whether it actually shakes your personal ethical convictions. But there is also a question here about whether a play which looks like it's primarily about personal ethics and personal freedom of choice and freedom of action, also has a more overtly political message or symbolism, because there are lines where Gregers reads a bit like a character from Dostoevsky's The Devils or something like that. He's the one who comes in, and we're told that he's lived away from the town and has been a troublemaker in his father's business up north, trying to introduce justice, encouraging the workers to sort of rise up and demand their rights. There's a bit of the implication of that. He doesn't just want families to be based on truth, he wants society to be based on truth. And there's one line where Relling says to him, you say this is going to lead to a happy and truthful marriage. Have you ever encountered a happy and truthful marriage? And Gregers says, no, actually, I never have encountered one. But, I can imagine what one is like. And that's like a picture of the idealistic revolutionary. The realist would say, so you're telling us about this perfect future society, but has one ever existed? And the revolutionary says, well, no, no one's ever encountered such a society, but that's no reason not to press ahead with truth-telling. Do you think that's there too in this?
There is definitely a political message there, but I was also reading a little bit about the reception in Norway of this play when it came out, and I was reading that there were discussions around what this was doing to the desire for democracy, and the fact that these were the years in which, there was expansion of the electorate and this notion of democratic institutions and the importance of kind of thinking about democracy from the principled point of view. And in some ways, I think, again, you can read it politically as a play about convention. So the old Birkin story of people have their habits, and these habits have time on their side, and then they just mature, and there is a kind of wisdom there that you can't really begin to poke from the outside with ideas of what a just society should look like. And this was actually his argument against revolution, to some extent against democracy as well later, the kind of typical conservative argument against democracy. And in some ways, he politically might represent exactly this kind of revolutionary idealist character who wants to bring change on the right terms for the right reasons, is right at some level. Again, this is where I started saying, when you read the play at the beginning, you identify, well, I at least identify with him and with his intentions, and his intentions are completely admirable. And then you realize that there is a kind of contrast between the just and the good. And so that sometimes the form of the good that people develop through these conventions, through these habits, through ways that aren't necessarily acceptable, work for them, or at least look like their work. And there is no legitimacy from that point of view to anyone coming in from the outside and disrupting them. So it was really interesting to read that there were all these discussions about what implications this might have in Norway for people's desire to actually go and have democratic institutions. And then another part of it is obviously a lot of Ibsen is about class society. And this is a play about bourgeois superficiality and hidden deals and ways in which individuals screw each other, just like Gregor's father does with his former partner. You see that in a lot of his other plays. I mean, people will know Doll's House, for example, in Ibsen's. It's always a lot of discussions are about in this play, maybe a little bit less on capitalism and how capitalism also distorts human relations. But in other plays, it's very, very prominent.
It's interesting, though, because there are the two life lies that I mentioned. So there is the life lie of the family, and there is the life lie of the invention. The invention is a kind of prop. It's a belief in a better future and the possibility that though he's living a hard scrabble life, with a bit of help and ingenuity, he might transition to a better way of life. You could almost say, I have no idea if this was in Ibsen's mind, but you could almost say that democracy is the invention life lie. Representative democracy, liberal representative democracy. And blowing up the family is the revolutionary response. And it does seem to me a little bit like Gregor's. He does leave the illusion of the invention intact. He's not a total revolutionary. He doesn't say to his friend, you've got to start from scratch. He's saying if we can really rectify historic injustice, then this other thing actually could be a very productive way to transition to another future, even if there isn't an actual invention, even if democracy isn't really democracy, it's just that modern representative version. But in order to do that, he's got that revolutionary streak, which is, and maybe you relate to this, I mean, in our conversations, which is that real democracy is going to require a settling of past injustices.
Absolutely. And also this idea that there is a kind of true self that is somehow distorted by convention, by artificiality, or by certain social pathologies, in my case, capitalism, or forms of priority that family life takes, or social life, or, some other form of identification, religion, culture, what have you, which in some ways, it's okay to have these things, but you want to have them for the right reasons. So these are all important associations, but we need to know what they are, and we need to not just have them as with the invention, but you also have it for the right reasons. And what he's trying to do is to bring those right reasons out and to undermine this notion that you could actually just want them either for no particular reason or just because that's just the way you get along. And so, again, in many ways, I see it as a dilemma between convention and some kind of proper taking your fate under control, somehow being in control of your life, and all the very demanding conditions that come with that.
So there is a potential political reading, but it's also a play that some of the symbolism feels deeply religious. Gregor's is both a bit Christ-like, and he may also be the devil. And the initial party that he attends, there is a 13th person at the party, and people are rather worried. Normally there are only 12, and this time there are 13. Actually, initially we're meant to believe that the 13th person is Hjalmar Ekdal, because he's the one who doesn't normally get invited. But at the end, we're sort of told that the 13th person at the feast was actually Gregers, and Gregers embraces that role. And at the same time, it's not difficult to read this play as symbolically, profoundly psychological. The attic is the attic of the mind. This is, I think, a pretty classic theme in Ibsen. A lot of action takes place in rooms that you don't see, which are the recesses of people's minds, and mad things happen in these rooms. There's quite a lot of madness in these plays, and there's quite a lot of madness actually in this one, or something close to madness. In your various, I'm really interested in how it struck you differently at different times. So there's a children's book reading, there's a political reading about personal freedom, religion, psychology. How did it change at different points? So, for instance, was there a point where you read this and thought, this is really about how people deceive themselves? It's primarily about the different rooms that we all have in our head.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I always missed until actually I read it for now, went back to reread it because we were going to discuss it, was the religious element. And so that's also very interesting how I somehow never picked up on this. So there's obviously very clear references there. And one of them is that Gregers, the son, is the one who comes as the redeemer in a way. And so he's presented when he comes as this Christ-like figure that will bring true justice and true reconciliation to the world. And we are led to believe at the very end that, as you say, he's something like the devil, and that in fact, and that he's actually the Antichrist. And a lot of it is about ambiguity. And I think what also makes the play really appealing for me is that it does something that I don't think a lot of philosophy does very well, which is to just articulate ambiguity and to make you engage with it without necessarily being able to resolve it. And, as a philosopher, you always want to kind of figure out what's going on and what's the right argument and what's the right answer. And what I think makes the play really powerful for me is that it's a reminder that there are some things that just need to be brought out as ambiguities, and maybe it's very, very hard to resolve them, or at least there is no answer that can really give a kind of complete definitive resolution to a conflict. And I think that's in this case, the play pushes that the idea that you might have an answer, that you might have truth, that you might have reconciliation, really pushes it to its tragic consequences. But in doing so, reminds you that maybe that's not what you should want. And that makes it, from I think both a moral and a political perspective and a philosophical perspective more generally, really difficult to grapple with and to accept, because most of what we do as philosophers is actually try to get clarity. And this is a play that shows you that clarity is not what you should want sometimes, that you should actually be content with letting certain things be. Or maybe it's about the ways in which he intervenes. I sometimes, when I return to this play, I sometimes think about, well, how can one still believe in Gregers' stance, but without having these tragic consequences? What is wrong with his intervention? What goes wrong? Did he pick the wrong time? Or was it the wrong way of doing it? Or is it just that this is a one individual? And so should there be a collective force that's, is it about the way in which certain interventions take place? All of these are questions that come to me because I think I'm not really satisfied with the answer, with this idea that, well, there is this ambiguity that you just need to live with. But I'm also not satisfied then with the opposite impulse, which is, well, then resolve the ambiguity. And this is what the play does. And that's why I think it's so deep, because every time you go back to it, you realize that it's, it makes you grapple with your own contradictions in ways in which only really amazing literature does, actually.
And the ambiguity extends even right to the end. So when I was reading it, the feeling was that when Gregers discovers that as a consequence of his pursuit of ideal justice, a 14-year-old girl has either died in a tragic accident or taken her own life, it would shake him. And, in a way, he would have what I think is the human response. And also it is at least potentially a response that some political philosophers would encourage, which is never think that your idealism doesn't come always attended with the possibility of tragic unintended consequences. There's a classic, so you could a Weberian response. But he doesn't have that response. He doesn't embrace the tragedy. He says, I still did the right thing.
Yeah, I wonder whether we should say a little bit more about how he gets to this, why the daughter dies in the end, because I think maybe for people for people who haven't read the play, the key moment in the play is when Gregors goes and reveals that he's married, that Hjalmar has married his father's lover, and that his daughter might not be his daughter. The result of that is that he's estranged from his daughter, who he was very fond of, and the daughter is very fond of the father. So there's this whole father-daughter relation that's very, very important. And the daughter begins to feel very uncomfortable about this, and so she keeps thinking, what can I do? Is he angry with me? What can I do? The other really beautiful part in the play is that she has this degenerative condition where she's about to become blind. And again, this is where I see this as the transition. She's 13. She's in this cusp transition from childhood to adulthood. And I think there's this implicit suggestion that childhood has more clarity because there's more clarity in innocence than the transition to adulthood, where you actually lose your sight and you become blind to certain things that you just understand naturally and spontaneously. But anyway, she's trying to then do something to make her father love her again. And the suggestion is made at some point in the play that if she kills the duck of which she's very fond, then this will be one way in which she will show, and then the father will be so moved by this, then he will then forgive her. And so the duck becomes this sacrifice that is needed to set the relationship on the right terms again. And that's where the play really ends with, you hear this shot in the attic, you think she has killed the duck, and that's finally, and Gregors thinks justice has been done finally. And then they go and discover that actually shoot has gone into her own heart. And we don't know whether it's suicide or accident.
But it's possible that she has decided the only real sacrifice is to sacrifice herself.
Is to herself, yeah. Or that she loved the duck so much that she didn't want to kill the duck, and so instead she kills herself. And that's how I read it when I was little, that it was about this kind of great love that, you can only sacrifice, or you can only have by killing yourself. And that's how you show both the love to the father and the love to the duck.
And when Gregors discovers that she's dead, maybe killed herself, maybe it was an accident, he still is trying to push the line that in the end, this is another truth that will drive her parents, though one of them we think is not her actual natural father, to some kind of, if not reconciliation, some truth. And Relling says, no, it won't. Even this event, the most terrible of all events, will very soon be overlaid by stories and fantasies. People will have to turn it into a life lie. And he says, come back in a year and you will see that her father has mythologized her death in a way that he can live with. He won't have turned it into the basis of his new truth. He will have folded it back into the lie of his life. And that's literally where the play ends. They part disagreeing about what will be true in a year's time, one believing the ultimate sacrifice, whatever it was or whatever caused it, will lead, in a Christ-like way to the promised land, and the other one saying, no, it won't. It will be folded into the lie, which is to live in the world.
That's right. And that's where, again, talking about these kind of religious metaphors, it's as though Gregors is revealed as the devil, and then the real Christ, the real innocent, is actually Hedvig. And so the real victim there is the person who was completely unrelated and really only wants to act out of love throughout. And she's the only one who hasn't done anything wrong at any point in the play. Everyone else has something strange and something dirty and something tainted in their past. And she's the only one whose life has up to that point been completely, fully reconciled, because she's there. She loves this duck. She's in the attic and she loves her parents. Even her condition, she's kind of, Ibsen is hinting at this blindness all the time. But it's, something that it's part of the family, and they've accepted that as well. And they somehow reconciled themselves with this, with the fact that she will become blind at some point.
She is the wild duck, perhaps. But it's also true that one of the things that persuades the man who thinks he's her father that he's not her father is that the old villain, Gregors' father, is also going blind. And he thinks this is a hereditary degenerative disease. So you have the innocent girl who's about to lose her sight. And in a way, you have the corrupt old man who has the luxury of blindness. He's about to get remarried, and everything is about to become even more misty for him, which is good news for him because he definitely doesn't want to see the truth. I love that as well. Just as a little detail, you've got these two versions of blindness, but it's what persuades. It's actually the final nail in the coffin for Hjalmar, that of course she's not my daughter because they're going blind and I'm not.
That's right. Yeah.
I want to ask you about one other character. So people might think it's odd we've not mentioned another character. There are two central female characters in this. I mean, there are a few others, but Hedwig, the daughter, but also her mother, Gina. And Gina's a really interesting character because she's kind of realist all the way through, in a sense that everyone else at various points is either speaking symbolically or seems to be playing a symbolic role. And she's the pragmatist throughout. She's certainly, she knows her own story. So she's the one person who's known the truth throughout. She doesn't think it needs to be a big deal. She doesn't think it needs to be the end of her marriage. She certainly doesn't think it needs to be revealed. But then when it is revealed, she's still kind of thinking about how we can make this work until her daughter actually dies. She's almost like a character from a different play. It's quite odd.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because I think there are two pragmatists here. So she's one of the pragmatists and Relling is the other one. So the neighbor, he's constantly the one who is telling Gregors he's doing everything wrong and he can't do this to this family and he just needs to let them be and get out of their lives. And in some ways, their positions are similar. But I find in the case of Relling, there's much more awareness about the fact that, yes, this might all be a lie and we know it. And he's the one who keeps going on about a life lie. And the fact that everyone needs a life lie and just let the life lie be. So he has some kind of superior position there, superior knowledge that Gina doesn't have or doesn't articulate in that way. She just does it. It's a very kind of, this is who I am, this is what my life is, and this is what it takes to get on. But she hasn't got a theory behind it. Whereas Relling, I think, has also got a theoretical articulation of this position, which is to say, well, sometimes we just have to let the norms be and not go and try and poke around people's lives or society's lives too much. Whereas I think Gina is more, but interestingly, I think in some ways different from some of the other Ibsen characters. Well, I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting question. She doesn't look like a victim. She's not a woman victim in the play. She's an agent in some ways. She's the only one who has full truth. So it's also interesting because in some level there is a gender component in the play as well, and as there is in a lot of other Ibsen plays, some much more prominent. So the Doll's House much more prominently about gender dynamics and gender and capitalism and so on. But in this one, I think it's really interesting to see that this protagonist, she doesn't have any superior position about society. But the way in which she's depicted is already somehow empowered. She's just got it all together and she's just figured it out and lives with it and gets on with it.
Yeah, I was going to say that Relling, to me, he's a capital P philosophical pragmatist, and she's just a pragmatist. In the way you might say that was quite pragmatic. You don't mean that that's the basis of a course in a philosophy department in a university. You just mean it was a pragmatic thing to do. And in a way, all the men have pretensions to more than what they do. Even the old man with his hunting, it's a kind of, they're projecting. Relling is trying to build a thesis off the back of this. And his arguments with Gregors are like, arguments in Dostoevsky or Thomas Mann or something between opposing positions. It's always men who are having these arguments. And each of them is kind of ratcheting up the scope of what they are doing. Halmar, even he's not a pragmatist and he's a slightly hopeless sort of person, but nonetheless, he has his invention and his life lie, and he believes in something that's not true. All the men have
philosophies, and what women have is love and sentiment. And I mean, in some ways, that's again a kind of trope.
But it's also true that you have the idealist, Hedwig, but she's not the capital I idealist. She's not the philosophical idealist. She's just a girl who does something maybe astonishingly self-sacrificing and naive and heartbreaking and human. And then you have the pragmatist, her mother, who's not a capital P pragmatist, surrounded by capital P pragmatists and capital I idealists and truth tellers and rationalists and all of that. These men not living public lives, because it's not a public play, it all takes place in the domestic setting, but projecting in ways that you can see could be public arguments. And then the two women are just, they're kind of living the arguments, and they are the ones who suffer in the end.
They are living the arguments, but I think there's also something that really shapes both their relationship and the way they relate to the world, which is love. And there is a kind of purity about love that nobody else has. So they are the only ones who have this immediacy and this instinctive love for each other, for the unity of the household, but they also do the right thing in some ways naturally, and so there is no intermediary there. I think I was also it has often made me I really love Dostoevsky, and I think there's always in Dostoevsky also a naive character. So you think about the idiot, or there's various in every novel. There is, as you say, a philosophical debate between these different, Faust and Mephistopheles type figures, and then there is always a naive character which is brought there to say, well, look, it's love is just very simple. All you have to do is just love. And again, it's something that's not satisfying for any philosopher, that you hear this sentence and say, well, actually, love is all that matters and all you need to do is love. But there is no need for any other imperative or any other moral system or anything. You put the human at the center of relations, and you just think about that relation as shaped and characterized by love. And that's all there is to say, really. And these characters that are these kind of naive characters like Hedwig and other characters in Dostoevsky, who come up to just make that point, sometimes with their life, sometimes with their and maybe that's also what Christ is. That's what one interpretation is, that this is just, that's it. There's nothing else to be said. It's not the church. It's not what comes after. There's just this one sacrifice of oneself for the sake of humanity and for the sake of love for humanity, and everything else is too complicated. I think that's what maybe that's what suggests that this Hedwig is more like the Christ character in the end than the one that we are led to believe at the beginning is the Christ, is the liberator.
I've got one more question, but what you said there, it does remind me of something almost from my childhood. I think I was 18, but I've always remembered this. This might seem like a bit of a stretch, but at Live Aid, the great concert that was held for famine relief in Africa, Elvis Costello came on stage with a guitar and he said, with all of these bombastic bands, Queen and everything else, and he said, I'm going to play you an old Northern folk song. And then he just strummed away All You Need Is Love by the Beatles. And it provoked this furious reaction from people because they said, that's an obscene thing to say in the face of the starving in Africa. The consequentialist said, no, it's not all you need is love. What you need is money. And the deontologist said, no, you need justice or whatever it is. And I've always remembered that and I've never known what I thought about it. Actually, I was more on the side of the people who are angry. I thought it's a ridiculous and sentimental gesture. But over time, I've slightly changed my view about it. But enough about Elvis Costello. The last question is, when we talked about freedom, I said to you, from what you're describing, I hear it as a kind of faith. And you said to me, it is a kind of faith. It's a faith-based view of politics. It's not religious faith in a conventional sense, but it requires faith. And as you've been talking about this play, it sounds a bit like the kind of thing that could shake someone's faith. I think if I shared your faith, this would shake my faith. I don't share your faith, so I read it slightly differently, but I still found it quite harrowing, I have to say. Is it for you like the things that might shake a person's religious faith?
Absolutely. Yeah, which is also why I think, yes, it is. And because I think it articulates this position really well, which is, the limits of the Kantian approach to the world, basically, of morality, the limits of justice prevails over everything else, and you just need to do the right thing for the right reasons. And that's a position that I can defend from all perspectives and against a lot of objections, and then also give it a much more specification socially and politically. And it comes with, as we talked about, the ideal notion of democracy and of freedom. And then you read something like this. It's a very simple play about a family, and it just unpacks one by one all the theorems on which this view of the world is based, this Kantian view of the world. And you can either reject it and say, well, actually, it's just a play and this obviously doesn't take into account, but then you'll be intellectualizing, and then you'll be like Gregors in trying to respond it in an intellectual way. You'll become exactly like the character that is being depicted. Or you can just take it in and think about it and try and live with it. And as you say, it's exactly the kind of thing that shakes one's faith. And sometimes one needs to live with a shaken faith as well, and to try and kind of think and rebuild oneself around this faith that gets kind of shaken fundamentally. And what I also think is, and this may be what's, whenever I think of the relationship between philosophy and literature and why I love to do both and to write in both ways, is that philosophy, whenever I write philosophical stuff, gives me a lot of certainty. And then when I write in a literary way, all the certainties collapse, because then you see the individual implications of all these different things that we pronounce as abstract statements. And there is something that comes from that way of thinking and writing, which is fundamental doubt, which is really, really hard to keep together with the philosophical part, because, in philosophy, you want to remove doubt, you want certainty. And then literature just gives you more and more doubt. And just like this plate adds to your doubts if you see the world in a certain way. It doesn't have an alternative. It doesn't give you a superior view. It's not that Ibsen is trying to say, well, actually, then you should go with the Hedvig view and you should believe in love or something like that, or see things in this other way. It doesn't resolve anything, doesn't aim to resolve anything. And this tension between the two is very, very hard to take, but I think worth also striving to keep together somehow. I don't have an answer but of how I do it, but I just try to kind of keep them together.
If you're a regular listener, you will know that we did a series with Lea Ypi on the history of freedom, which touches on quite a few of the themes that we were talking about there. You can get all of that on our archive, and you can get the 2 bonus episodes that we recorded for that series with Lea if you subscribe to PPF+. You will also now find, as another bonus, Robert Saunders talking about his favourite political novel, George Eliot's Felix Holt. Just go to ppfideas.com or click on the link in the show description. Next time, I'm talking to another regular contributor, Helen Lewis, about a novel that many people will have read, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. We're going to be talking about why we love it so much, whether we should love it quite as much as we do, and about some of the many attempts to revise the reputation of one of the world's best-loved books. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.